My name is Zara Okonkwo. I am 27 years old. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened at that party. Before I tell you about the woman in the green dress, and the speech that wasn't supposed to happen, and the photograph that changed everything about how I understood my own life. I need you to understand that I spent 26 years believing a particular story about myself, about my family, about what I was worth to the people who were supposed to love me without condition, and that believing a story for that long makes it very hard to see the moment when the story breaks open and shows you something true underneath it. The story I believed was this: I was difficult. I was too much. I was the child my father had not quite planned for, who arrived in his life at the wrong time, who required things he did not know how to give, and whose need for those things was itself the problem. If I had been easier, smaller, quieter, less hungry for something I couldn't name, things would have been different. The distance between my father and me was a consequence of my own character. This was not something anyone had said to me directly. It was something I had assembled, over years, from the texture of 100 small moments, the way you assemble a picture from pieces without anyone ever handing you the box with the image on the front. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what it felt like to stand in the lobby of the Harrington Grand Hotel on a Friday night in October, in the dress I had bought specifically for this occasion, having driven 3 hours to be there, because my father had called me, actually called me, not texted, called, and said he wanted me to come to his company's anniversary party, that it would mean a lot to him, that it was time for people to meet his daughter. His daughter, he said those exact words, his daughter. I held that phrase in my chest the whole 3-hour drive like a small, warm thing I was afraid to examine too closely in case. It turned out to be less than I thought it was. Let me tell you about my father. His name is Desmond Okonkwo. He is 58 years old, and he is the kind of man who occupies rooms in a way that makes other men stand differently. He is tall. I got his height, which is one of the few things I got from him that hasn't cost me anything. And he has a face that is almost preternaturally suited to the expression of authority, the particular combination of bone structure and bearing that means people assume he is in charge before he has said a single word. He came to the United States from Nigeria at 22 with an electrical engineering degree and a sponsorship from a company that no longer exists. And he built himself, over 30 years, into the VP of operations at Meridian Industrial Solutions, a mid-sized manufacturing company in Hartford, Connecticut, that makes specialized components for aerospace and defense contractors. He is impressive. He has always been impressive. As a child, I found his impressiveness aspirational in the way you find a mountain aspirational, something you can see clearly, that you orient yourself toward, that you never quite reach. My parents' marriage lasted 11 years and ended when I was 8, and the ending was, I understand now, with the perspective of an adult who has read enough about family systems and attachment theory to fill a shelf, about more than the things they said it was about. My mother, Ifoma, is a different kind of person from my father. She is warm in the way that fills rooms in a different way than he does, not with authority but with presence, with attention, with the specific gift of making whoever she is talking to feel like the most interesting person alive. She is a nurse, has been a nurse for 25 years, and the care she gives patients is the same care she gives the people she loves, which means it is total and unsentimental and precise, the kind of care that sees you as you actually are rather than as you'd like to be seen. They were incompatible in the particular way of two people who are both too much of something, he too contained, she too open, and after 11 years of trying to fit together in a way that their natures didn't support, they separated, and the divorce was finalized the summer I was 9. I stayed with my mother. This was not a contested decision. My father did not contest it, which was the first data point in the story I was building about myself, filed quietly in the back of my mind without conscious acknowledgement. He did not fight to keep me. He paid child support consistently, I will give him that. He called on my birthdays, usually. He came to my high school graduation, sat in the bleachers in a suit that made every other parent look underdressed, applauded when I walked across the stage, took a photograph on his phone that he may or may not still have. He attended, at intervals, the major events that could not be missed without comment. He was never cruel. He was never abusive. He was something that I did not have a clean word for until my therapist. Yes, I have a therapist. Her name is Dr. Falake Ademi. She is Nigerian-American. She has been my Thursday appointment for 2 years, and she is the reason I have any of the language I'm about to use, gave me one. He was absent in the way that can look, from the outside, like presence. He showed up. He just wasn't there. His second wife is named Constance. They married when I was 12. She is white, originally from Connecticut, grew up in the kind of New England town that has a village green and a congregational church and a level of social cohesion built on a specific shared assumption about what people look like. She is not unkind. She has never been actively unkind to me. What she has been is proprietary. That is the only word that fits. She is proprietary about my father in a way that includes being proprietary about what his history looks like, about the narrative of his life, about the family portrait. They have 2 children together, Tobias, who is now 18, and Lily, who is 14, both born in Connecticut, both enrolled in good schools, both living in the 4-bedroom house in Westport that Constance's parents helped finance, a house that I have been inside exactly 4 times, all occasions that involved my physical presence being navigated around with a careful politeness that was more exhausting than open hostility would have been. I have a half-brother and a half-sister I barely know. This is the architecture of my family. I am telling you its dimensions because the party makes no sense without them, and the party, and everything that happened at the party, makes no sense without understanding that I arrived there carrying 26 years of this architecture in my body like a house. I'd been living in so long I'd stopped seeing the walls. He called me on a Tuesday evening in September. I was in my apartment in Boston. I live in Allston. I work as a graphic designer for a mid-sized branding firm called Pellucid Creative. I have a cat named Biscuit and a very good library and a friend group that I will get to in a moment. And I was eating leftover pasta and watching something forgettable on my laptop when my phone lit up with Dad, which is what I have him saved as, Dad, lowercase in my heart, even when I try not to let it be. I answered on the 3rd ring, which is the specific delay I impose on myself, so I don't answer immediately and reveal how much his calling still moves something in me. He said my name. He said it the way he always says it, with a formality that some people mistake for affection and that I have spent 20 years trying to decode. Zara, how are you? We talked for a few minutes about nothing, about work, about my mother's health. Fine. Good. She had recently started growing tomatoes on her apartment balcony and had described this project to me in more detail than I had expected, about nothing. And then he said, Meridian's 25th anniversary is in October. There's a gala event. The company is doing it properly this time, venue, dinner, the whole thing. I'd like you to come. I said, you would. I heard the surprise in my own voice and hated it. He said, of course, you're my daughter. I'd like people to meet you. There it was again. You're my daughter. I said, okay, yes, I'll come. He gave me the details. I wrote them down. We talked for another 2 minutes. He said it meant a lot to him. I said, okay. We hung up. I sat in my apartment with my pasta cooling beside me, and I felt something that I can only describe as the particular combination of hope and defensiveness that you feel when someone who has the power to hurt you offers something that looks like love. You want the love. You are also, after enough history, automatically bracing for the thing that comes after the love. I should have listened to the brace. I need to tell you about my friends, because they are in this story in a way that matters, and because they represent the thing I built when the things I was supposed to be given weren't given. Priya Subramaniam is 30, my oldest friend in Boston, met on the first day of my undergraduate art program at MassArt when we were both trying to find the same studio room and ended up lost together for 20 minutes. She is a textile designer whose work is currently in 3 gallery shows and who will deflect every compliment about this by asking if you've eaten. She is the first person I called after my father's call, because she is the first person I call for everything. And when I told her what he'd said, "You're my daughter, I want people to meet you," There was a silence on her end that said everything about what she thought before she said, carefully, "How do you feel about going?" I said, "I want to go. I know I want to go." She said, "That's different from how you feel about going. This is what it is to be known by someone." She said one sentence and turned the whole thing inside out. I said, "Terrified, hopeful, mostly terrified." She said, "Do you want me to go with you?" I said, "I don't think I can bring." She said, "I know you can't bring me to the event. I mean, do you want me to drive with you, be nearby, be available?" I said, "Yes, please." She drove with me to Hartford. She sat in the hotel bar 2 floors below the event, in her own nice dress, with a book and a gin and tonic and her phone with my number ready. And she waited there from 7 o'clock until 11:15, which is the specific kind of love that deserves more than a paragraph, but that is also entirely consistent with who she has been to me for 9 years. My other friend in this story is Nnamdi Ez, 29 years old. He grew up in Lagos, came to the U.S. for his undergraduate degree at Boston University, stayed, works now in tech in Cambridge. We met through a mutual friend at a Juneteenth barbecue 3 years ago and became close with a speed that surprised us both, the kind of friendship that arrives already feeling established, like it pre-existed the meeting. He is the funniest person I know, and also the most perceptive, which is a combination that means he can make you laugh at something and simultaneously show you something true about it that you wouldn't otherwise have seen. Nnamdi is the one who, when I told him about the party and what my father had said, immediately asked, "What do you know about his company, the people there?" I said, "Not much, he's VP of operations." He said, "Research it." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're going into a room full of people who have a version of your father. You should understand the room you're walking into." He was, as usual, right. I spent 2 evenings doing research. Meridian Industrial Solutions had a website with a team page, and my father's profile was there, a professional photograph, a brief bio. Desmond Okonkwo, VP of Operations. 22 years with the company, degrees listed, board memberships listed. The photo showed him in the same posture I knew, contained, authoritative, presenting exactly as much as he chose to present. I read through the company's recent press. They'd had a significant contract announcement in aerospace components, had expanded their Hartford facility, had been profiled in a trade magazine with a quote from my father about operational philosophy. I read his quote 3 times. It was about precision and accountability, about knowing exactly what every component is and what it does and where it fits. I thought about that, knowing exactly what every component is and what it does and where it fits. I also did the thing I had never quite let myself do before, which was look at the LinkedIn profiles of people who worked at Meridian and had listed Desmond Okonkwo as a connection. I saw colleagues, direct reports, people who had worked with him for years. I saw, in several profiles, warm endorsements, things like exceptional leader, always made time for his team, the kind of mentor you remember for your whole career. The kind of mentor you remember for your whole career. I put my laptop away and I sat in my apartment and I looked at Biscuit, who was sitting on my bookshelf with the specific feline expression of absolute indifference to human suffering, and I said out loud, "He was the mentor to other people's children." Biscuit blinked. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. The dress I bought for the party was navy blue, fitted at the shoulders, with a kind of structural elegance that I associate with Priya's influence. She had come shopping with me and had pulled it off the rack with the confidence of someone who had been trained in visual composition and said, "This is the one." It had sleeves. It was professional in a way that said I belong in any room without apology. I had my hair done on the afternoon of the party, a blowout that gave me the kind of smooth, deliberate look that reads as intentional from across a room. I was, in the precise sense of the phrase, putting on armor. Priya drove. We talked the whole 3 hours, about everything and nothing, about design projects and her gallery show, and a man she was seeing who had the promising quality of being genuinely interested in her work. We talked about my mother, who had texted me that morning, "Be your whole self tonight, Zara. Not just the parts you think people want. which was, in typical IFOMA fashion, exactly the right thing and slightly terrifying to receive. We pulled into the Harrington Grand's parking structure at 6:45. The event started at 7. Priya looked at me in the passenger seat and said, "You know who you are." I said, "I know." She said, "Not a reminder, just a fact." I got out of the car. I went inside. The Harrington Grand's ballroom was on the 4th floor, and when I stepped off the elevator, I could already hear the sound of a party in its early confident stage. Voices and music, and the particular acoustic quality of a large room that hasn't yet reached full capacity. There was a registration table outside the ballroom doors where a young woman in a blazer was checking names against a list. I gave my name, Zara Okonkwo. She found it, marked it off, gave me a name badge with my first name on it in a clean sans serif font. Just Zara. No last name on the badge. I noticed that. I put it on. I walked in. The room was large, well-appointed in the corporate event way, round tables with white linens, floral centerpieces, a bar along one wall, a small stage at the far end where a band was setting up. About 150 people, I estimated, in various stages of arrival. The demographic was what I had expected from my research. Mostly white, mostly middle-aged, professional in the way of people who have worked their way into positions they take seriously. I got a glass of white wine from the bar. I stood for a moment and looked around the room. I saw my father. He was standing near the center of the room with 3 other people, 2 men and a woman, all in the 50 to 60 range, all with the specific body language of people who are comfortable here, who belong here without question. He was holding a glass of what looked like whiskey. He was smiling. He looked exactly as he always looks, impressive, contained, precisely calibrated to the room. He saw me. Something moved in his face. I have spent my whole life trying to read his face, and I am still not fluent in it, but this was unmistakably a form of surprise, recalibrating, a fraction of a second where the version of this evening he had in his head and the actual version intersected with a small collision. He recovered immediately. He raised a hand in acknowledgement. I crossed the room. "Zara," he said my name when I reached them. He kissed me on the cheek. This is a gesture we perform in formal settings. It has always felt slightly ceremonial, like a protocol we agreed to rather than an instinct. And then he turned to the 3 people he was with. He said, "This is Zara." And then, I want you to feel the pause that came next. The pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds and that contained multitudes. The pause that was also a choice. A fork in a road he chose the wrong direction on, he said. This is my other daughter." His other daughter. Not my daughter Zara. Not this is Zara, my eldest. Not even the somewhat formal "this is my daughter from my first marriage." His other daughter. The 3 people smiled the polite smiles of people who have registered the phrasing and chosen not to examine it. The woman, I would later learn her name was Bet. She was the company's chief financial officer, said, "How lovely, nice to meet you." One of the men said something about welcome. The other one asked if I worked in the industry. I said, "No, I'm a graphic designer." They nodded. The conversation moved on. The way conversations at parties move on, with a kind of social hydraulics that fills silences and smooths transitions and carries everyone forward so that no one has to stand still in a moment long enough to feel what it actually contains. And I stood there in my navy dress with my wine glass and my armor, and I felt the armor do what armor does, not prevent the wound, but absorb the first shock of it, hold the surface together while the actual feeling goes somewhere deeper and waits. His other daughter. I smiled. I participated in the next 4 minutes of conversation. I watched my father from the side of my vision, watched the way he moved in this room that knew him, that had 22 years of him, and I thought, these people know him in a way I don't, and somehow that makes this worse, not better. Then I excused myself to get another drink, and I found a corner near the bar, and I texted Priya a single word. Happened. She texted back 30 seconds later, "I'm here. 2 floors down, you know who you are." I stood in that corner for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I was watching the clock on my phone with the specific focus of someone who is doing internal triage, who is assessing damage and deciding on a response before the next thing happens. 4 minutes. And then something shifted in me. I can't describe it as a decision exactly. It was more structural than a decision, more like a hinge turning, like a door swinging from one side to another. I had come 3 hours to be in this room. I had spent 26 years being the other daughter, the first marriage daughter, the one who didn't quite fit the frame of the life my father had built after us. And I had, by virtue of being my mother's daughter and my own person, and the recipient of 2 years of Thursday appointments with Dr. Falik Ademi, developed a specific skill set that I had not previously deployed in this context. I knew how to be in a room. I knew how to talk to people. I knew how to find the thing that a person cares most about and ask them about it in a way that makes them light up. I knew how to listen with my whole face and how to say true things that land gently and how to make a stranger feel, within 6 minutes of meeting me, that they are interesting and that the conversation they're having is worth having. These are skills I learned from my mother, who learned them from nursing, who learned them from the understanding that people's fundamental need is to be seen. I did not learn them from my father. I learned them in spite of the example he set, or perhaps in direct response to it, as compensation for what was not given. I put my wine glass on a high table, straightened my dress, and walked back into the room. Not back to my father. Away from him. The first person I talked to properly was a woman named Diane Osai Mensah. Yes, Osai, which made me smile in the way of a small private joke. Who was the head of HR at Meridian, and who was standing near the floral centerpiece of a table with the particular expression of someone who has organized this event, and is watching it unfold with the vigilance of someone who knows exactly where every potential problem is. I introduced myself. I said, "I'm Zara. I'm Desmond Okonkwo's daughter. Are you the one who put this together? Because the room looks genuinely beautiful." She turned to me with the expression of someone who has just been said exactly the right thing. She said, "You're Desmond's daughter. Oh, he's never mentioned. Yes, I led the event planning committee. Did you have a look at the centerpieces?" We talked for 12 minutes about event design, about the way you create atmosphere in a corporate space without it feeling corporate, about how she had sourced the flowers from a local florist in Hartford who had done 3 previous Meridian events and who had built a house style that Diane trusted implicitly. She told me about her background, marketing degree, 15 years in HR, a previous role at an insurance company that she described with a humor that meant she had survived it and was glad to be here instead. She was warm and sharp and funny, and I liked her immediately. At the end of our conversation, she said, "You know, I've worked with your father for 9 years and I didn't know he had a daughter who did design. He talks about Tobias and Lily constantly, but..." She stopped. A small recalibration. "Anyway, it's lovely to meet you." I smiled. "Lovely to meet you too." I moved on. The next person was a man named Conrad Webb who was, according to the name badge I had been reading all evening because this is what a designer does automatically, the director of supply chain operations, and had therefore worked directly under my father for the past 6 years. He was standing near the bar with a beer and the demeanor of a man who was at a work party, because attendance was culturally mandatory, but who would genuinely have preferred to be watching football? I got a fresh drink, stood near him, and said, "Supply chain. I always want to understand what that actually involves on a day-to-day basis, and I've never had anyone explain it to me in a way that made the abstraction concrete." He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who has just been asked, for possibly the first time at a company party, to talk about the thing they actually know. Then he put his beer down on the bar and said, "Okay, so imagine you're trying to get a component that has 17 tolerance specifications to move from a supplier in Wichita to an assembly facility in Connecticut in a way that preserves all 17 of those tolerances across." We talked for 17 minutes. I asked genuine questions. He gave genuine answers. By the end of it, he had explained to me the specific complexity of aerospace component logistics in a way that was actually fascinating. And I had told him I was a designer, and he had told me his daughter was studying graphic design at RISD, and we had talked about RISD, and he had told me to tell her to look at the design department's materials lab. When we stopped, he said, "You know, Desmond never mentioned, are you just in town, or?" I said, "I came up for the party specifically. My father invited me." A look passed over his face. "He invited, right, of course." A beat. "It's good that you're here. Another small stop. Anyway, good talking to you, Zara. I want to slow down here and tell you what was happening, because it would be easy to read this as a revenge narrative. Girl gets snubbed. Girl decides to show up everyone at the party, satisfying comeuppance, applause. And there is a version of what I was doing that looked exactly like that from the outside. But that is not what it felt like from the inside, and the inside is what I'm trying to give you. What it felt like from the inside was, I am here, I exist, I am real, and if my father has created a version of his life in this room that has erased me from it, then I am going to make myself visible not to embarrass him, but because I refuse to participate in my own erasure. Not tonight, not anymore. That's different from revenge. Revenge requires that you do something to the other person. What I was doing something for myself. I was filling the room with my own presence in the only way I knew how, through genuine connection, through care, through the very human act of being interested in other people and letting them be interesting to you. Every conversation I had was real. Every question I asked, I wanted the answer to. Every person I talked to that evening was actually worth talking to, and I found them worth talking to, and I think they felt that. You cannot fake the quality of attention that makes people feel seen. My mother's skill, my own skill, not performance. But also, I was absolutely aware of what I was doing and why, and the two things were true at once, and that is what it is to be a grown woman who knows herself. I talked to the company's founder next. His name was Elliot Hargreaves, 71, white-haired, with the slightly formal bearing of a man who built something with his hands and has watched it become larger than his hands can hold, which he seems to regard with genuine wonder rather than proprietary anxiety. He was standing near the stage, where the band was now playing softly, watching the room with the particular attention of someone who has spent 50 years reading rooms. I introduced myself. He said, "Desmond's daughter. I didn't know he had, of course how wonderful." This was the third time that evening that someone had started a sentence about my father not mentioning me and had stopped in the middle to recalibrate. I noted it, filed it, kept going. Elliot was extraordinary. He talked about starting Meridian in 1999 with 3 people and a leased facility, and a contract from an aerospace company that was too big for where they were, and that they had met anyway because that was the only option. He talked about what precision manufacturing meant to him, not as corporate mission statement, but as actual philosophy, the belief that when something's job is to hold together at altitude or under pressure, the margin for error is not a margin. It is a threshold, and you either clear it or you don't. He asked about my work, and I told him about graphic design, about what it meant to build a brand identity, to find the visual language that expresses what a company actually is rather than what it thinks it should look like. He was genuinely interested. He said Meridian's brand had never quite caught up with what the company had become, and that they'd had 3 agencies try, and none of them had gotten it right. I said, "What does it feel like? The company, the thing you've built. What does it feel like from the inside?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Precision, reliability, the kind of trust you build over decades of never letting something fail." I said, "And the brand doesn't express that." He said, "The brand looks like a company that wants to express that. That's different." I said, "Yes, it is." He looked at me for a moment, and then he laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that happens when something lands. He said, "You know, if you're ever interested in a project conversation, I'm serious. Leave your card with Diane." I said, "I might just do that." Time passed. I moved through the room. I had by 9 o'clock talked properly, not mingled at a party talked, but actually talked, with 11 people. Deanne, Conrad, Elliot, a mechanical engineer named Felix Oduya who had come from Lagos 2 years earlier on a work visa, and who was the only other Nigerian in the room, and with whom I had a brief electric conversation entirely in Yoruba proverbs that made him laugh until he had to put his drink down. A woman named Sylvia Barker, who was the executive assistant to the CEO, and who had been with Meridian for 18 years, and who knew the history of every significant decision the company had ever made, and told some of it with the dry wit of someone who has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. I talked to a young woman named Amara Diallo, who was the most junior person in the room, 2 years out of college, in an entry-level logistics role, wearing a dress that was slightly too formal for the event in the specific way of someone who doesn't yet know the unwritten dress code of these rooms. I remembered being that person. I sat with her for 15 minutes at a table away from the main current of the party and asked her about her work and what she wanted from it. And she told me, carefully at first, and then with more confidence as she realized I was actually listening, about the specific supply chain problem she had identified in her department that she wasn't sure how to bring up to management without it seeming like she was overstepping. I said, "What's the worst version of bringing it up?" She said, "That I look like I'm criticizing the way things have been done before I've been here long enough to have standing." I said, "What if that framing isn't about standing at all? What if you frame it as a question rather than an observation? Something like, I've been trying to understand why we do X this way, and I think I might be missing something. Can you help me understand the history of this decision?" She looked at me for a moment. Then, "That's exactly right." I said, "You're clearly smart. The people here will figure that out faster if you give them room to be smart too." She said, "How do you know all this?" I said, "I've been the newest person in a room many times." She asked who I was, and I told her I was Desmond Okonkwo's daughter, and she said with a kind of unguarded surprise that was somehow both funny and devastating, "He's your dad. He's been really kind to me. He stopped me in the hallway on my second week and told me my ideas were worth saying out loud. I was terrified of him, he's so, and he just said that, out of nowhere." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That's good to hear." And I meant it. It was good to hear. It was also, somehow, one of the harder things I heard that evening, that he had known to say the right thing to a scared 23-year-old in a hallway, and had not known to say it to me at any of the moments in my childhood when I was that scared 23-year-old in a hallway. I excused myself and went to the bathroom and stood at the sink for 2 minutes. I texted Priya, "I'm okay, but it's complicated." She replied, "Complexity is just depth. You've got this." I dried my hands and went back out. By 9:30, the dinner service had concluded, and the band had shifted from background music to something more danceable, and the room had achieved the specific quality of a party that is now fully itself. People had drunk enough to be genuinely in it. Conversations had grown louder and more interesting. The formal architecture of the event had relaxed into something more human. I had eaten at a table with Felix and Sylvia and a project manager named Roland, and a woman named Patience Assant who was in accounts payable, and who had the most extraordinary laugh I had heard in recent memory, a laugh that seemed to come from somewhere structural, like it was built into her at a foundational level. My father was at a table across the room. I had been aware of his location all evening in the way you are aware of something that is both important and potentially dangerous, a weather system on the edge of your peripheral vision. I had seen him look at me several times from across the room. Each time, I had been in the middle of a conversation, and each time I had simply continued the conversation. At 9:45, Elliot Hargreaves took the small stage. He gave a speech that was, for a corporate anniversary speech, genuinely moving, about what 25 years means in an industry built on precision and long-time horizons, about the people who had built the company through its difficult years and its good ones, about what it meant to him that Meridian had survived and grown while staying true to what it had been built to do. He mentioned several people by name, long-tenured employees, key contributors, people who represented something essential about what the company was. He mentioned my father. He said, "Desmond Okonkwo has been with Meridian for 22 of our 25 years, And if you want to understand what operational excellence actually looks like in practice, not as a phrase, but as a daily reality, you spend a week in his department. He holds this company to a standard that I believe has saved us from ourselves more than once, and I'm grateful every day that he chose us. My father, at his table across the room, nodded with the contained grace of a man who is accustomed to being recognized and who receives recognition exactly as he presents himself, with precision and without excess. Applause. And then Elliot said, "Before I leave the stage, I'd like to acknowledge a few guests who have joined us tonight." He went through a small list. A representative from their primary aerospace client, a state economic development official, a couple of others. He looked out at the room and then, to my complete surprise, he said, "And I met someone tonight who I have to mention. Desmond's daughter Zara is here, and she's a graphic designer with apparently a frighteningly accurate read on brand identity. And if you talk to her, you'll understand where Desmond gets it from. Zara, raise your hand." The room looked. I raised my hand. About 150 faces turned to me, including, from across the room, my father's. Applause, polite, warm, genuine. And then Elliot said, and I believe he meant this as a simple compliment, had no idea of the weight it carried, was just saying what he actually thought. "I'll tell you all, Desmond, your daughter knows how to work a room. She's talked to nearly everyone here tonight. If she ever wants to get into the people's side of this business, she has the gift for it." He stepped off the stage. The band resumed. I put my hands in my lap and felt something I cannot fully name. Not triumph, not relief. Something more like the feeling of a pressure that has been building for a long time finding release. Not violently, but steadily. Like a door finally opening on a room that has been closed too long. My father came to me 20 minutes later. He moved through the room with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who has decided to do something and is doing it at his own pace. He sat down in the empty chair at the table where I was still sitting with Patience and Roland and two others. And he said something that made the table smile, and then he looked at me. He said, "Walk with me for a minute." I said, "Okay." We walked to the edge of the room, near a set of tall windows that looked out over Hartford at night, the particular beauty of a mid-sized city, the lights strung across the dark, the feeling of a place that is substantial without being overwhelming. He stood next to me and looked out the window. He said, "Elliot likes you." I said, "I liked him too." A pause. He said, "You've spent the whole evening talking to people." I said, "Yes." Another pause. Outside, a car moved slowly through an intersection, its headlights sweeping the road. He said, "When I introduced you earlier, the way I said it." I said, "His other daughter." The words sat between us. He said, "I know how that sounded." I said, "How did it sound?" He was quiet for a moment. My father is a man who uses words the way he uses everything, precisely, after consideration, without excess. When he takes longer than usual to find words, it means the words he needs are not the ones he is accustomed to using. He said, "It sounded like I was making you smaller than you are." I turned and looked at him then, his profile in the window light, the face I have been trying to read my whole life. I said, "Yes, it did." He said, "I've been making you smaller than you are for a long time." I did not say anything. I waited. This is something I have learned, that some things require the space of silence to become fully said. He said, "I didn't think of it that way. That's not an excuse. I'm saying I didn't see it as something I was doing. I thought of it as just the situation, the circumstances, the way things had arranged themselves." A long pause. "That's not how it looked to you." I said, "No." He said, "How did it look to you?" And this is the moment. The one I had not planned for, that I had in no version of this evening scripted, that arrived without warning and stood there asking to be answered with honesty. I said, "It looked like I was an inconvenience, like I was the part of your life that didn't fit with the life you were actually living. Like showing up was the minimum required to be technically present, and that was different from actually being there." He didn't flinch. I had half expected him to redirect, to qualify, to bring in Constance or the divorce or circumstances. He didn't. He said, yes. One word. I said, why? And this is what I want to tell you about. The thing that broke the story open and showed me what was underneath it. The layer I had not known was there. My father said, when your mother and I separated, when you stayed with her, I told myself it was better for you, that you needed your mother more than you needed me, that my being present in a difficult way would be harder for you than my being absent in a clean way. A pause. I told myself that story for a long time. I said, was any of it true? He said, some of it. The part about the difficulty, yes. I wasn't easy to live with. I'm not easy to live with. The way I am, controlled, private, not expressive in the way you needed, that your mother could be, I told myself that you were better served by her. I said, and the rest of the story. A longer pause. He said, the rest of it was that I didn't know how to be what you needed, and instead of learning, I stepped back. And stepping back got easier. And the easier it got, the harder it was to step forward, because then I would have had to acknowledge that I had been stepping back, and that meant acknowledging. He stopped. I said, what? He said, that I had failed you, that I had been failing you for years, and every year it was harder to face, and so every year I stepped back a little further. The city lights outside the window, the sound of the party behind us, the band playing something with a steady bass line. I said, I thought it was me. I thought I was too much, or not the right kind of daughter, or something I had done or was, or... He said, no. And this time there was something in his voice that I had not heard before, not the authority, not the precision, but something underneath those, something that had been there all along, covered by all the covering. No, that was never, you were never the problem, Zara. You were never too much. I was, he stopped again. Then, very quietly, I was not enough. I'm going to be honest with you. I did not cry at that window. I have cried writing this. I have cried telling Priya about it and Dr. Adami about it and my mother about it. At the window, I was too inside it to cry. I was in the specific state of someone who is receiving something they have wanted for a very long time and whose body doesn't quite know what to do with it, a kind of suspension, a waiting for it to become real. I said, I don't know what to do with this. He said, I don't either. I said, that's honest. He said, I'm trying to be. I said, I know this took something to say. He said, it's the least I could do. It's not nearly enough, but it's, he looked at me. It's real. I want you to know it's real. And there was the word that had been missing from everything. All the birthday phone calls and the graduation appearances and the technically present years of the minimum required. The word that was the difference between performing presence and offering it. Real. I said, I came tonight because you called me and said you wanted people to meet your daughter. I came because some part of me still. He said, I know. I said, don't do that, let me say it. He went quiet. I said, I still want to know you. I still want you to know me. I have wanted that my whole life, and I have spent my whole life trying to not want it as much as I do because wanting it hurt. Tonight you introduced me as your other daughter, and I spent the next 2 hours talking to everyone in this room, and part of that was because I was angry and I didn't know what else to do with the anger, but part of it was because I wanted to be seen. Not by you specifically. Just by someone in your world. I wanted to exist in your world for one night. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, you've existed in my world every day for 27 years. I've been the one who wasn't looking. I'm going to tell you about the woman in the green dress. Her name was Wren Holcomb, and I had noticed her earlier in the evening, not because she stood out dramatically, but because she had a quality of stillness in the room that I found interesting, the specific stillness of someone who is observing everything and processing it internally. She was about 45, with short hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she had been sitting at various points throughout the evening at tables near the edge of the room, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching. When my father and I finished our conversation at the window, we didn't resolve 26 years in one exchange. We never could, but we had cracked something open that I think neither of us fully expected to crack that night. And then we had stood there in a silence that was not uncomfortable. which was itself new. I excused myself and went to find Priya's number on my phone and sent a text that just said everything changed, and I'll explain everything in the car. I was standing near the bar, composing this text, when Ren appeared beside me. She said, "I've been watching you all night." I looked up from my phone. She said, "I'm sorry, that sounds alarming. I don't mean it in an alarming way. I mean I've been watching the way you move through a room, the way you talk to people, and I've been thinking, she either does this for a living or she's learned it somewhere very particular." I said, "I'm a graphic designer." She said, "Interesting, so you read rooms the way you read compositions." I said, "I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes." She said, "I'm the CEO of Hargreaves Group. Elliot is my father." I said, "Oh." She said, "I come to the Meridian anniversary events every few years. Dad loves them. I find them useful because they're a reasonably accurate read on where the company actually is versus where the leadership thinks it is." She smiled. "Your father runs an extremely solid operation. You probably know that." I said, "I know it from Elliot's speech. I know it from the people I talked to tonight." She looked at me with interest. She said, "You talked to Conrad Webb." I said, "For 17 minutes. His daughter is at RISD." She said, "You talked to Diane Osimensa." I said, "She organized this whole event and nobody had told her it looked beautiful." A pause. She said, "What do you charge for a brand identity project?" I said, "That depends on the scope." She said, "Let's say a mid-sized holding company that has acquired 4 companies in the past 3 years and needs to build a coherent visual identity across all of them without erasing the individual brand equity that makes each acquisition worth what it was paid for." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "That's a substantial project." She said, "Yes, that's why I'm asking what you charge." I said, "Can I ask how you found me? You didn't know I'd be here tonight." She said, "I didn't, but I've been watching you all night, and Elliot mentioned you from the stage, and then I went and found your badge and looked up Pellucid Creative on my phone during the dinner service, and I looked at the portfolio section, and I found your individual work on there because your name is listed on 3 case studies, and I spent 20 minutes looking at the Alderton Foods rebrand and the Novetta technology work." I said, "Those are both mine." She said, "I know, the Alderton work is particularly, there's an integrity to it. The visual language does exactly what you said to my father. It expresses what the company actually is, not what it thinks it should be." She reached into her small clutch and took out a business card, actual physical card, thick stock, restrained typeset, the mark of someone with strong opinions about communication, and handed it to me. She said, "I'd like a conversation, next week if you're available." I took the card. I said, "I'm available." She said, "One more thing." I said, "Yes." She said, "I heard what you said to Amara Diallo about giving people room to be smart." I said, "You were nearby." She said, "I was at the next table. She's a good one, Amara. She's been trying to figure out how to raise that process issue for 2 months. A pause. "Your advice was right. I'm going to make sure she's in the right room to raise it." I said, "She'll be glad to know someone's listening." Ren Holcomb put her glasses down from the top of her head, clicked her pen, and smiled. She said, "So will you, I hope." I found my father before I left. He was at the table where he had been sitting, now with Elliot and 2 other older men, in the warm, late-party conversation of people who have eaten and drunk and talked, and have arrived somewhere comfortable. I touched his arm, which is a physical gesture I cannot remember initiating in my adult life, and he looked up. I said, "I'm going to head out." He stood. He walked me toward the elevator. At the elevator bank, we stopped. He said, "You have Constance's number." I said, "No." He said, "I'll send it to you. I think she and you should talk. There are things she understands about our situation that I haven't let her explain. I've kept things in compartments." I said, "That sounds like you." He said, "Yes." The elevator arrived. I pressed the button for the lobby. He said, "Zara." I looked at him. He said, "I'm going to do better." I said, "I know you mean that." He said, "I do mean it." I said, "I know. I also know that meaning it and doing it are different things, and that the only way I'll know which this is time." He looked at me for a long moment. And then he said something that I have thought about every day since, that sits in me in a permanent way, like the best things said to you by the people who matter most. "You know, you're the most like me of any of my children, and I've spent 27 years acting like that was a coincidence." The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. I said, "It wasn't." The doors closed. Priya was in the hotel bar with a finished gin and tonic, and a second one she had clearly ordered on instinct at some point. And when I came through the bar door, she looked at my face and said, "Tea or debrief?" I said, "Car, I need to be moving." We walked to the parking structure. I didn't speak until we were in the car and she had pulled onto the highway, the city lights falling behind us in the rearview mirror, the highway opening ahead in the dark. Then I talked for 45 minutes straight. I told her everything: the introduction, the other daughter, the room, the conversations, Elliot's speech, the window and my father and what he said, Ren Holcomb and the business card that was sitting in my jacket pocket like something radioactive in the best possible way, Amara Diallo, Felix Oduya's laugh when I found the right proverb, Deanne, who had never been told the room looked beautiful. Priya drove and listened and said nothing until I ran out of words. Then she said, "The other daughter." I said, "Yeah." She said, "You walked into that room as the other daughter and you walked out as..." I said, "As myself." She said, "Yes." We drove in silence for a while. The highway was quiet, the kind of late-night road quiet where you feel the distance covering behind you. She said, "What do you need right now?" I said, "Music and not having to talk." She put on a playlist she'd made. She has a specific gift for this, for knowing what music a moment needs. And we drove the rest of the way home with the windows cracked and the October air coming in and the playlist cycling through songs that were old enough to feel like memory. And I sat in the passenger seat of my best friend's car and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that resembled being whole. The Ren Holcomb meeting happened the following Thursday. It was not a preliminary conversation. It was a working session that lasted 3 hours and ended with a signed letter of intent for a brand identity project that was the largest commission I had received in my career by a factor of 3. My boss at Pellucid had complicated feelings about this, which were resolved when I told her the Hargreaves Group name, and she went quiet in the way of someone doing rapid arithmetic and then said, "We can work something out." We worked something out. I lead the project. Pellucid benefits from the relationship. Everyone gets what they need. This is not why I went to that party. I want to be clear about that. I did not go to Hartford to network my way into a career opportunity. I went because my father said he wanted people to meet his daughter, and I wanted to believe that was true, and it turned out to be complicated and true simultaneously, which is how most important things are. But I would be telling you a smaller story than the real one if I pretended the professional outcome didn't matter. It mattered because it was evidence that showing up as yourself, completely, without making yourself smaller to fit a room that hasn't yet measured your full dimensions, produces things. Real things. Not always, not every time, not in every room. But when it does, those things are yours in a way that nothing produced by contraction ever is. I need to tell you what I learned from Amara Diallo, because she taught me something I didn't fully understand until 3 weeks after the party. She emailed me. She had gotten my contact from Diane, who had asked me for a card before I left. I had not brought cards, had not expected to need them, had given her my email address handwritten on a napkin from the bar, which felt right somehow, foundational, the right kind of beginning, and Amara had tracked it down. The email said, "I talked to Diane about the process issue. She brought me to a meeting with Conrad Webb. Conrad brought me to a meeting with your father. I presented the issue as a question, the way you said, and your father said it was an excellent question and put together a small working group to address it. I don't know if I said it clearly at the party, but your father has been genuinely kind to me since I started, and I think he might be a different person at work than you've experienced in other contexts. I don't know if that's useful or painful information. I'm sorry if it's the latter. I read that email 4 times. Then I called Dr. Adami outside of our regular appointment, which I almost never do, and I told her about it. She said, "How does it land?" I said, "Both. It's both useful and painful. It's useful because it means he's capable of it, the presence, the attention, the right thing at the right moment. It's painful because..." She said, "Because he was capable of it with other people's children while not being able to find it for you." I said, "Yes." She said, "What does that tell you?" I thought for a long moment. I said, that it wasn't about me, that it was never about me, that it was about something in him, something about the weight of what he owed me specifically, the guilt of the years of absence that made it easier to be good to a stranger than to show up for the person he had already failed. She said, "Yes, and..." I said, "And that means the story I built, the one about being too much, about being the wrong kind of daughter, that story was never accurate. It was filling in for a truth I didn't have access to." She said, "What do you do with that?" I said, "I put it down, the old story. I put it down and I pick up the thing that's actually true." She said, "What is actually true?" I said, "I am not my father's absence. I am everything that grew in spite of it." My mother called me the Sunday after the party. Not to check in, she had texted the next morning, and I had told her the broad shape of it, but to tell me something specific, something she said she had been deciding whether to tell me for several years, and that the party had made her feel it was time. She said, "When your father and I separated, he asked me once, about a year after, if I thought he should try to be more present, more involved. He said he wasn't sure he knew how. He said he was afraid he would do it badly, and that doing it badly would be worse for you than not doing it." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him doing it badly was still doing it, and that you would understand the trying even if the execution wasn't perfect." I said, "And?" She said, "He thanked me, and then he continued to do it the way he had been doing it." I said, "Which was?" She said, "From a distance, with the minimum required to be technically present." I sat with that. I said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She said, "Because you deserve to know that he knew. He was given the information and he made a choice. Not a malicious choice. He made a scared choice, a private choice, the choice of a man who could not bear to fail at something important and so avoided the attempt. But it was a choice." I said, "That's..." She said, "I know. It's harder in some ways than thinking it was ignorance." I said, "And easier in others." She said, "Yes, because it means none of it was about you." My mother, 25 years of nursing, 25 years of seeing people clearly and saying the true thing. I said, "How did you know it was time to tell me?" She said, "You've been walking around for 26 years carrying a story that was never yours to carry. After Friday night, I thought maybe you were ready to put it down." I said, "I think I am." She said, "Good. Now tell me about the design project because Priya told me and I want to hear it from you." I have one more thing to tell you, about the night itself, that I saved because it's the smallest thing and also somehow the most important. Before I left the party, before the conversation with my father at the elevator bank, before Ren Holcomb and the business card, I went back to the table where Amara Diallo was sitting. She was alone now, the others having drifted to the dance floor or the bar. She was looking at her phone with the expression of someone who is deciding whether to call it a night. I sat down across from her. I said, "One more thing." She looked up. I said, "You're going to second-guess the way you raised it. After you raise it, you're going to wonder if you said it right, if you framed it right, if you were too forward or not forward enough. That's normal. Do it anyway." She said, "How do you know I'll second-guess it?" I said, "Because you're smart enough to see all the ways something could go wrong. That's the thing that will make you good at this work. It's also the thing that will make you doubt yourself. You have to hold both. She said, "Did someone tell you that when you were starting out?" I thought about it. I said, not in so many words, but someone showed me. My mother, she's a nurse. She makes hard decisions every day and she makes them anyway, even knowing they could be wrong because the alternative is not making them, and that's always worse. Amara said, "What's her name?" I said, "Ifoma." She said, "That's a beautiful name." I said, "Yes, it means good thing." My name is Zara Okonkwo. I am 27 years old. My father introduced me as his other daughter at a company party, and by the end of the night, 150 people knew exactly who I was. Not because I staged a confrontation. Not because I gave a speech or caused a scene or did anything that required the room's specific attention. Because I did what I have always done, what my mother's love and my own long practice of learning to be present have made me able to do. I walked into a room full of strangers, and I was genuinely, completely, irreducibly myself. His other daughter. I have thought about those words so many times since October. I have sat with them, turned them over, asked them what they mean and what they cost, and what they reveal about the man who said them and about me and about what happens next. Here is what I have concluded. I was never his other daughter. I was always his daughter, full stop, the one who came first, the one who carries his height and his precision and his capacity for controlled, deliberate, careful work in everything I do. I was his daughter when he was absent, and when he was technically present, and when he stood at a window in Hartford and said, for the first time in my memory, that he had not been enough. I was his daughter when I was 8 and sitting in a car watching him drive away from the house where we had been a family. And I am his daughter now, sitting at my desk in Boston with a business card from Ren Holcomb and a cat named Biscuit and a best friend who knows when to drive and when to be quiet and when to make tea. The other in his sentence was not about me. It was about him, about the split in his life, the before and after, the compartmentalization of a man who had organized himself around precision and found that the emotional mathematics of fatherhood didn't reduce cleanly. The other was his word for the part of his life he hadn't reconciled. I refused to carry it. I am putting it down here, in this telling, in front of you. I am Zara Okonkwo. I am 27. I design things that tell the truth about what they are. I talk to people in rooms, and I ask them what they care about, and I listen with my whole face. I drive 3 hours when someone important to me uses the word daughter and means it, even when using it badly. I stand at windows in hotel ballrooms with my father, and I say the hard, true things because I was raised by a woman named Ifoma, good thing, who taught me by example that the hard, true things are the only ones worth saying. I am not my father's other daughter. I am my mother's full daughter, completely, in every cell. And I am becoming, slowly, in the way that all real things become, through time and through the work, and through the willingness to keep showing up even when showing up has cost something myself. That is not a small thing. That is everything. For anyone who has ever been introduced as the other version of themselves by someone who should have known better, you are not the other. You are the original. You were always the original. The room just needed to meet you. Zio,